This is Chewing the Gristle with Al Black and Tim Conroy. We're a poetry chat. And this week, our poet is Marc Olmsted. Marc may be just the last of the beat poets. Marc has 5 books of poetry and has appeared in New Directions in Prose and Poetry, City Lights Journal, New York Quarterly, Outlaw Bible of American Poetry, and a large international variety of small presses. Twice nominated for a Pushcart Prize, Olmsted received the San Francisco Acre Award for Poetry in 2014, along with David Meltzer and Ishmael Reed. He has been practicing mindfulness meditation since 1974, teaches at writers.com, and is an author and recognized expert on Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs. Welcome, Marc Olmsted.
Hey there. I hope I can live up to that. I want to correct one thing though. Beat poet, I would be called, let's say, by the scholars, a post-beat poet, because the beats technically, if you weren't writing by 1965, you're not. The beat historical chapter is 1950 to 1965. That's a sort of Whitney Museum choice. So if you weren't writing before then, you were not a member of the beat generation. So they call it post-beat, or sometimes they call it other things, but that's the one that's sticking now. So, we still have Gary Snyder is alive, and Diane DePrima is alive, and Ruth Weiss is alive. That may be it, though, right now. Oh, they often say Ann Waldman is a member of the Beats, but if you look up sometimes her biography, they say associated with the Beats, because she did start writing after 65.
Yeah.
Although
so
she's often connected.
Tell us, you can't be 25 years old and call yourself a hippie.
Yeah. Well, although they are, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of amazing, it's like young people have this sense of beat and punk and hippie is all being somehow together because of things like Burning Man. Yeah. And when, I was really into the punk scene, and we just totally disdained the hippies, and I had been a hippie, of course, so I was rejecting my hippie past, mainly because, the punk scene was much more cynical, Love and light was not exactly on the menu.
So, can you tell us about your poetry journal and education, and who were your early poetry influences?
Well, originally it's interesting because my father, Nelson Olmsted, was a character actor, and he actually he had a radio show, and then that ended, and then he recorded Edgar Allan Poe. And so he did several albums of Edgar Allan Poe, and so the first poetry that I heard was Poe, and which when I was really young scared the shit out of me. But, later I grew to appreciate Poe, and then also my father had happened upon Ray Bradbury in his first collection, which was called Dark Carnival. It was the first to use Bradbury in the radio. And so I was reading Bradbury, or my father at first was reading to me Bradbury. And even though he's not, let's say, he is known somewhat for poetry, I don't particularly like him as a poet, but his prose is, of course, incredibly poetic. And his use of metaphor in particular, which really I connected with. So it was very easy to then see that as I got older, probably discovered the beats around age 13, and see, when they say, Malak whose ear is, some sort of metaphor, as in howl of this sort of thing. It made total sense to me, this connection of metaphor, the image without like in it, with this, just crammed together as a metaphor. And that was extremely exciting. I thought, wow, this is great. So that was the beginning. And then, of course, the beats, and then reading the beats led into who influenced the beats. But that was much later. We're talking about William Carlos Williams and Whitman and Ezra Pound. And of course, all the way back to Shakespeare and this sort of thing, where I started hearing Shakespeare. And I was very lucky. I had a Shakespeare class in high school. And, all the musicality of that language, the sound of that, which began with hearing Poe, literally hearing Poe, from my father. Long-winded answer.
Oh, well, that's okay. So, as a poet and also somebody that's made film and music and everything, what is the place of the arts in today's world?
Well, the main thing, I think, if we want to be of some sort of benefit, even in observing, a currently very dark time in our country, to observe it accurately is a kind of sacredness. It isn't sacred in the sense of love and light, but it's sacred in terms of just accurately recording the way a haiku often does, and just expanding on that. Often some haiku are very sad, but they're very profound. They have some sort of mournful element or some sort of element of passing of time and of decay and death. And at the same time, there's a real bittersweet quality. And I think that art in general has that capacity of lifting up things to at least appreciate them with a sort of sacred view and with a sort of empathy to others' suffering. That is very, very useful and literally inspiring.
What role does empathy have in poetry specifically? Or does it have a role in poetry?
Well, it depends on who you like to read, but, Whitman ultimately, he phrased what was his poetry about. He said candor. And Ginsberg expanded on that and said, candor ends paranoia. So what that means, and of course Ginsberg excelled at that, was that, if you were brave enough to reveal your own real thoughts, others would go, oh my God, I think that too. I thought I was the only one. And there's a great freedom in that, and that you're not, that there is a sort of basic goodness to humanity, which is certainly something that we need to return to or reflect on in order to keep from utterly destroying ourselves. Whether you're talking about Anne Frank or in her final comments in her diary, or anyone, this idea that somehow to live is to suffer in a lot of ways. And everyone has some sense of that, no matter how privileged they are. And from that kind of ground, we can have a basic warmth or generosity extended out to anyone who suffers, if you have the shred of decency. And I really think most people do, in spite of having this sociopath president. who may be an exception in a lot of ways, but somewhere down in there, impossible to reach in this particular lifetime for him, I'm sure, because he's so damaged. Somewhere down in there, there is some sort of wound that would be his door into connecting with others. But I don't know whether there's any current psychotherapy or meditation or that could possibly reach that defended area, because he's so broken. He's obviously a broken man, which is in some ways we can actually, although people may not like the idea, you can have, he what comes around, what goes around comes around, he is going to suffer horribly for his crimes one way or another, and almost too horribly, considering how much damage he's done. But
yeah, absolutely. Marc, when you write your poetry, or when you have a thought about a poem and you start writing a poem, do you steer, or does it drive you? Getting to that point, how much steering do you do, or how much do you allow the poem to take you?
I very rarely steer. I'll just write. I tend to use my poetry as a kind of journal. So, I'll start writing about whatever's going on in the day, whatever rises up in my mind. I try to write daily and in my notebook, and, I have a lot of poems about my cats as a result, which I will never see the light of day, but I do talk about them a lot because I find them so unbelievably cute. But, just sort of reflecting on, like what's going on in the Portland streets. I am a news junkie. I definitely, watch more news now than I ever have in my entire life. And that often filters in, or, anything, conversation with a friend, I have a phone call with someone and he says, they saw, he's in San Francisco and he says, they saw a coyote in downtown San Francisco. How dystopic is that? And so then I'll put that. I said, Tom calls from San Francisco, and then I'll put that quote into the poem. Whether it also, I don't know whether it's any good until really maybe even a month later, and I'll go back over the notebook, because usually I don't know right off the bat if I've written something good or not. And the other interesting thing in this regard is something Burroughs said, which I think in some ways was a joke, but he said, whenever I write something and I feel inspired, I throw it away. Which I don't really think is true, but I think the feeling of inspiration is not necessarily I think it's often what you just are jotting down without any thought about whether it's a good poem or not. That's often the best stuff, at least that's what I find.
So to you, what distinguishes, what are the elements that make up a good poem? What's a good poem for you?
Well, there's a lot, like, for instance, some of the people that I know might tend towards surrealism. So I don't necessarily know what they're talking about, but it still takes me somewhere. I am, sometimes you read a poem, for instance, the poetry that you see in the New Yorker, which is often unreadable as far as I'm concerned. I would not be a poet if that was the limit of it. Maybe I would. Occasionally there's good stuff. But there's such a manicured, polished, self-conscious quality to a lot of that poetry. I don't like that. It's I think Nietzsche talked about it, a distinction between the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And the Apollonian poet is a New Yorker poet. The Dionysian poet is clearly a beat poet. But the emphasis in the in what makes a good beat poem as opposed to a bad one, or an imitation beat poem, since we see a lot of that, especially in the post-beat stuff, that we go, oh my God, we know who he's imitating or she's imitating, but it's terrible. And part of what happens is when there's not some sort of mindfulness in terms of, whether it occurs spontaneously as an artist or you actually have some training as in Buddhist practice, some sort of attention to the specifics of phenomena. In my case, that's what interests me. Then it often is too generalized, or it turns into some sort of rant, and it may be spontaneous, but it isn't grounded. And so someone saying, war is bad, Trump is mean, or something like that. I mean, nobody wants to read that. It's boring. It's much more interesting if somebody starts talking about, I wonder what kind of underwear Trump wears. Does he wear underwear? How does he get his hair like that? And you start like imagining all the ways he gets his hair like that. Does he have sex with Melania? How long has it been? Things like that. That's much more interesting because those are specifics and everyone can relate to that. And they actually, even though you may not know, they would like to read what you imagine. At least I would if it was cleverly done. So for me, like Philip Whalen said, my poetry is a graph or picture of the mind moving, which is the same sort of thing like we see in James Joyce's Ulysses. To me, that's really interesting. The graph of the mind moving, accurately recorded, which is really the important point. Accurately recorded, because when you read Joyce, you really have a sense of this is a really magnificent example of how the mind works, and it takes real clarity and presence to be able to get that. Everybody can't just write their stream of consciousness. I mean, it's interesting because there's some letters between Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg on this very subject. Ginsberg sort of pushing for this approach, and Ferlinghetti saying, well, my mind isn't that interesting, so they were going back and forth in that. But I think everyone's mind is really that interesting. It's just a matter of how good you are at capturing it, this, you've probably heard the phrase, which is sometimes denigrated, this first thought, best thought, which Ginsberg at the very end of his life actually suggested an alternative, which is first thought, no thought, then see what comes up. Because I think, he was so tired of students saying, is this my first thought? Is this my first thought? Is this my first thought? That's, I thought this was my first thought, but you don't like it or whatever. So it's just establishing that there is always a gap between thoughts. And so if you get into that and you can notice the gap, then the next thought is the first thought, rising in the mind. Anyway.
Hey, Marc, it'd be a great time to allow you to read a few poems so we can hear some of those thoughts that ended up in some of your poetry.
Okay, that's a deal. Actually, it's interesting because I went back, I've done, these various Zoom things that happen. It's like I'm trying not to repeat myself in case anyone actually is watching them. So I actually decided, okay, now I'm going to go back to some really early stuff because I haven't read this stuff before for a very long time. So here's a very early one. I imagine this was from the mid-70s of the previous century. Japanese cripple bound to his machine, electric metal wheels beyond lust's eye or groan. He wanted a Pepsi and a meat sandwich, but the counter was too high. I helped putting silver change into his twisted hand, wanting to touch him, remembering the leukemia boy Mom gave a flashlight to in the hospital, what he wanted most, head swollen like an undersea fish. Now this broken form, eyes grew wet for his pain, yet grateful he permitted me the kind act.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Well, thank you. So you know, that's an example of something that just occurred. And then here's something more recent. You want me to keep going, right? A little bit?
Yes.
Or what's your... Okay. As the crow flies, the epiphany, 1p backwards, appears on the telescreen chair in front of me in the disco light of the trendy airline cabin. Now a crow, and the dark queen with radiant emerald hands. Now a warrior marching through fire. Touch anywhere to begin.
Wonderful.
So, just another description of you know, what I was observing, and I think okay, we'll try. We'll try. We'll do one more, and then we'll move on
Good.
here. Bat lesson. As a kid, I met Batman. He sat in the studio commissary for lunch. My father making FBI. Batman's cowl was off, and he wore horn-rimmed glasses. He didn't care. Safe inside the studio walls. Just a regular guy.
Was that the Adam West Batman?
Yes. It's a big thrill, as you can imagine.
Okay. My next question for you would be, do you have a process in writing your poems? And when do you know they're finished? And how much time do you spend with revision?
That's a very smart question. You know, I will write, you know, because I write daily, it's usually, okay, it's time to pick up the notebook. I have to write 1 page. That's my rule. So I fill up that 1 page, and sometimes, you know, I kind of run out of steam, but I still finish the page. I always date them because I think that's, you know, really interesting when you have the dates. Often I don't, if I send them out, I often don't include the dates, but in my own, you know, typing them up, I put them chronologically and I put the dates on them because, you know, that's like, for instance, what's going on in Portland streets right now. That becomes really important historically, whether anyone cares ultimately or not. But so at least fill up the page, and maybe it ends or not. And if I feel still inspired, I'll keep going and say, okay, we'll just keep writing. And the other thing that sometimes happens is that I'll pick up, I'll see, well, what did I write yesterday, you know, as I'm about to start. And I say, oh, you know, I have some more to say about that. So then I continue and I fill up another page, or maybe I go further. And then I say, okay, you know, part of me will say, ooh, this is really good, you know, and then part of me, I don't know, here, I'll read it to my wife or read it to my old friend, Richard Modiano, who I've known for many years. And sometimes they agree, sometimes, you know, Richard says, oh, that's really good, or my wife says, oh, that's not very good. Richard usually wins in that argument. But at any rate, I often just wait and don't do anything with it. And I'll go back and, you know, I'll start to look through the notebooks and I go, oh, I remember this seemed interesting at the time. And I go, but, you know, this isn't clear here. You know, for instance, there was a person in one of my classes who was writing a spontaneous line. and she wrote a line about, you know, a COVID mask moving like a tumbleweed down the street in the wind, which was a great little image. But she said something like, a mask blue, you know, caught in the wind moves like a tumbleweed. And obviously, I mean, she thought, oh, what color is it? You know, you know, she thought of blue after she thought of the mask. So she, you know, then later you might transpose, right? A blue mask, because it seems a little, sometimes you don't. Sometimes it actually sounds better. But if it's a little confusing, then you say, okay, it's a blue mask. It's not a mask blue. And then the other thing I suggested is I said, you should say it's cloth mask because it's not quite clear, you know, blue cloth mask. And so that element of revision, I think, is okay. And then, but as sometimes students will do, they'll say something like, you know, like somebody was writing, was really interesting, from a small town in France and talking about her cafe. And she said, well, everyone's sitting outside because it's tourist season. And then when she revised it, she changed tourist to high season. And I said, no, tourist season's better, you know. And a lot of times that happens, that people say, I'm going to change it to this, or I'm going to change it to that. I said, no, actually, you're, you know, I always say, keep the first draft, which is really important. Ginsberg was the one who started me on that, you know. Don't write over on your computer what was your first draft. Save it as a second draft, you know, if you're going to do a revision. Because you may go back and then a third time you say, you know, this is kind of awkward in some way. I'll rewrite that. So you rewrite the rewrite. Pretty soon you've totally lost the original first thought, which was tourist season. And then you've turned it into high season. Then you rewrite that and you say, when everyone comes in their bathing suits or whatever. And then after a while, it just gets so cluttered and confused and self-conscious that you want to say, well, what did I say the first time? You know, and you go back and you go, actually, that was better. Mm-hmm. So if you keep the first draft, it's not necessarily better, but it often is. So I think it's really important. But later, you know, like I say, I'll go through and I'll see if there are things like blue cloth masks or some other line. So, oh, well, this whole section is like really, I completely spaced out. And it's just, I'm jabbering. So I'll just cut it, you know. So it's like cutting or slight transpositions. I think that keeps the original graph of the mind moving. But over polishing and, you know, seeking the right word and then the right word of that right word, that's the Apollonian style that winds up in the New Yorker. And you really see that on the page. It's almost immediately apparent. You just feel it's so mannered, you know, it's so tight. It's just unreadable to me, you know. It's like sometimes, you know, like for instance, T.S. Eliot, you know, did a lot of revision, and Kerouac said, T.S. Eliot is good in spite of himself. So I thought that's a very good, there are poets who are good in spite of themselves, you know, who revise heavily.
Well, it makes me want to ask, Marc, in your scholarship of Ginsberg, do you know how many times Ginsberg was published in the New Yorker? Was he ever published in the New Yorker?
He was published when he was famous. Yeah. You know, that's the sort of thing, like, you know, there'd be an article on showing Kerouac's notebooks after Kerouac is long dead, you know. Oh, look, here in the New Yorker, here are pictures of his original notebooks. But, you know, one of the things that I did, I remember I wound up, of all things, spending a summer in Lincoln, Nebraska. Now, Lincoln, Nebraska is incredibly humid in the summer, and it's just like it's like the surface of Venus or something. You know, you just have to move from, you know, one refrigerated area to another. So I wound up, I was working half time, and I wound up spending a lot of time in the library. And one of the things that I did is I decided, using the various readers' guides and this sort of thing, this, of course, before the computer, I said, I'm going to look up and see what Time magazine said about the Beats in the 50s and, all the way up to the present. And generally, they were very snarky. They were really, really mocking them as what barbarians they were and how silly Ginsberg was. And they loved mocking them. And then, of course, they lasts long enough that it becomes famous. And then, they're very interested in Ginsberg. Ginsberg was still alive when he was published in the New Yorker. And Eric Drucker, who is a great artist who's done many New Yorker covers, there is I believe it's called Illuminated Poems, but it's a collection of poems that they didn't all appear in the New Yorker, but he did artwork for, which wound up going into that James Franco movie of Howl, where they have that whole animated section, which is pretty cool. I have to say that section's pretty cool. Drucker's a great artist.
In your practice of poetry, I know, curious about your mindful meditation practice. How does that play into your writing poetry?
Well, there's the one thing, we hear this phrase mindfulness, okay, you're in the moment, be here now. Oh, didn't we get that already from Ram Dass or whatever? But the important part of mindfulness is there's a second half to it. So they literally describe these with Sanskrit or Tibetan terms, but it's basically mindfulness and insight. So insight spontaneously arises. Mindfulness, you actually, you have a discipline, like counting the out breaths or something like that, or being present with the breath. So you space out, you return to the breath. But out of that, spontaneously, there's, as they say in 12-step recovery, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, there is a flash of insight. And what that flash is, and everyone has this when they do this practice, this is not some kind of attainment of mind, but everyone has some sort of gap in which they realize that what makes up our sense of ourselves are these strobing thoughts. I'm so-and-so, I do this, I'm hungry, I want this. And they're strobing and strobing and strobing, and they seem like the spokes of a wagon wheel, which when it spins very fast, looks like a solid disc. And so this is the solidity to say, I am Marc Olmsted, broke and arty poet, who will probably die in relative obscurity. But, in mindfulness practice, that slows down so that there's not really that solidity. And, for instance, Buckminster Fuller has a title of a book, so I seem to be a verb, so that there is a kind of openness that can spring up out of that mindfulness, can't push it. And in a lot of ways, that openness in terms of, we write in the same way that a jazz musician learns the scales of his saxophone, and then sometimes spontaneity or inspiration occurs out of that. Suddenly they are improvising. But, a lot of people, a lot of jazz musicians, when they talk about playing, it's like there's a kind of, it's like the zone of the runner or anyone. There's a zone where there's no longer a person playing the horn, there's just breath and the sound, and there's some sort of strange open zone. And I think that, so in that sense, I think it's that creativity and mindfulness practice are really very related, and they just, that a jazz musician has some kind of intuitive sense of that. Anyone who improvises has some sort of intuitive sense of that, whether a comedian or, jazz musician or whatever, or suddenly just being in the zone, or an actor, there is a kind of letting go in acting. You can't really, we know the difference between someone who's very self-conscious and someone who seems to be completely letting go into this performance, whether it's on screen or on stage. So I think that letting go rises out of that grounded mindfulness. And that's the connection. This is all, Ginsberg, and that I'm not coming up with these ideas myself.
No, it's great stuff. And I read your essay, Mind Breaths, Learning Buddhism from Allen Ginsberg, which I suggest to all the readers to go to your website and check out. It's fabulous.
Oh, that's very, very kind. Yes. Yeah. I mean, he had enormous impact, not only poetically, but, basically, his choice to really follow Buddhism, although he called himself a Buddhist, basically from like 1958 on, it was pretty muddled. It was pretty much of a sort of acid head sort of, he took acid in 61, but, that kind of period during the 60s that we all remember where, there's Buddha and there's Krishna and whoever else are going to toss in there, isn't it all the same, man? Well, not really. There are little differences, and if you want to be a Hare Krishna, then choose, intelligently. Now, it isn't because it's the same as Buddhism. If you're choosing, Hare Krishna instead of Buddhism, at least know what the difference is, or for instance, Kabbalah or whatever. If you're going to choose Kabbalah, know how that's different than, Jesus Christ or whatever, I mean, there should be some sort of intelligence about it because it isn't all the same. I mean, there are similarities, but they all have very specific paths, and some are have more clarity than others, as we know. You get quite confused even in Buddhism. You can get confused and think that things should be this way and not that way. You're doing it wrong.
So, for the emerging writer, how much should they let their emotions and interests guide what they write,
as opposed to
well, we live in a world where a lot New York poets, New York Times poets, or New Yorker poets are MFA students, and sometimes I think they write from what they believe,
what they've been taught, probably.
Yeah.
MFA, it's interesting, Diane DePrima said that when her students went and got MFAs, they came back and they were worse. And they said, I know, she said, all they know how to do is hide better. And I think that's very interesting because there was a friend of mine, who'd gone through a writing program, and, he sent me something that he had written about his childhood. And I said, there's some things that are not clear, that you're kind of evasive about. I don't quite know, he'd chosen some sort of aesthetic where it was intentionally vague. I can't really describe it, but that's what she meant. And I think that is one of the things that, when I was when I first gave my poetry to Allen Ginsberg, and, there were things where I was imitating some of the surreality of Kerouac or Gregory Corso, and he said, I don't understand what you're talking about. And of course, you know, if the man in the street said that, you would dismiss them in your arrogance ordinarily, or one would, you know, thinking like, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. But you know, when you hear it from Ginsberg, it's like, oh, that's something important, that you know what I'm talking about. And of course, that's a huge issue. So that in a lot of what comes out of academic poetry, you don't know what they're talking about. Or there's some sort of form that is so stripped down that it's not really even, it's like a kind of an in-joke in some ways. I'm not a fan. And believe me, they're not rushing to book me at any university. I'm not on their list. You know, so the MFA, actually, you know, somebody wrote me recently and said, do you think I should get an MFA? And I said, you know, what do you think that'll do for you? You know, I mean, I think it's really important it's great to become a student of someone. I think that, you know, whether by reading them or in some way, if you're lucky, actually connecting with them. And, you know, a lot of people have mentors, so it's very useful to have somebody who's smarter than you, or an elder of some sort who says, you know, I don't know what you're talking about, or, you know, when you say this, I become disinterested because you're saying it so in such a generalized Hallmark card kind of sentiment. You know, you need that. But in academia, you know, essentially it's a machine that perpetuates itself. You know, currently, you know, they got to maintain their position. They've worked hard to get it. They have to, you know, unless they bring in like some author who's successful from outside who isn't really part of it, then it's more interesting, you know. But you know, if they're rising up in the ranks and everyone is, you know, thinks, oh, the so-and-so has received this award or that award, you know, they must be good. You know, it doesn't matter. We secretly find it very boring, but but they made a lot of money. You know? They got the big prize from, you know, wherever.
Well, Marc, let me ask you the type of projects you're working on now, and what's the best way for people to get hold of your books?
Well, you put up on that little card very conveniently my website, so people can look at that. There's a couple of books that are still in print. You know, most of my stuff is not in print. You know, and I, you know, self-publishing, I'm like too old. I just don't care anymore. You know, I send a lot of stuff out to zines, but I don't really, you know, you make your 100 copies, maybe you sell them all, you know, or your 1,000 copies or whatever. It's just, you know, too much effort. You know, if somebody else wants to put it out after I'm dead, that's all right with me. But there is still a couple of things you can actually get a hold of. And that's all on the website. And there was a second, what I'm working on now. Well, besides the fact, you know, like I said, I write daily. And so there's just a, you know, I wind up generating more poems than I can type up. Although, you know, frankly, maybe 10% of them are actually good, you know, which is one of the things you have to get used to when you write daily. You know, or it can vary, you know, you never really know. But so there's a writing daily, and then I've been working on a manuscript which is along the lines of that Mind Breath article, a bigger version of that where I go through historically and describe the mindfulness of Allen Ginsberg. And for instance, here I'm going to hold this up. Let me grab this for a second. I'm going to do a promotion for somebody else. This is a galley copy of a new book that's coming out November 10th. And it's, for those who know Ginsberg's collection, Fall of America, these are the journals of Ginsberg from 1965 to 1971, edited by Michael Schumacher, who's really, for me, he's the best biographer. He wrote Dharma Lion, my favorite biography of Ginsberg. But it's really, the reason I bring that up is because it's answering a lot of questions about when Ginsberg really took on specifically Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche as his teacher. You can see it starting to happen then, because, it was a process. It happened over a few years. And that's the kind of stuff really interests me. So I'm trying to historically, actually, the manuscript is virtually done, although this book that I just held up has a few things in it that are already, I'm going like, holy shit, this is great. This really is talking, this is exactly what I thought, and here it is in print. All the journals, Schumacher's put out a couple of things that are really, he has South American journals and he has Iron Curtain journals. These are all very recent. And, for anyone who's interested in Ginsberg's work and wants to get some clarification about, this poem or that poem, I mean, these books are amazing. So anyway, this book, The Mindfulness of Allen Ginsberg, who knows how I'll ever get it out. I came within a hair's breadth of almost Shambhala picking it up, but then they said, I don't know whether we'll make any money on it ultimately. They liked it. And that's a big question. So if no one thinks they're going to make any money on it, I will wind up publishing it with a very, very small press. But it will get out there. That one I'm excited about because it's a big question. People say, I see so much error in a lot of the critical material about Ginsberg's Buddhism. They're saying, Ginsberg's Buddhism during when he was writing How. He was not a Buddhist when he was writing How. It's just the complete confusion. And it is an important distinction for him. It was an important distinction, where he really did accept certain hard facts of existence, like sickness, old age, and death, which is really, or that suffering is ever present or everything changes. These sorts of things, you can't stay high and love God all the time, which was kind of what he was looking for before that, because of his Blake vision and LSD and Tim Larry and, chanting mantras ecstatically. You have to come down and you have to deal with that, whether you come down in a gentle way or in a car crash, But these are this is the facts of existence. We have to deal with that. Otherwise we're in a fairyland of some sort of, fantasy, about, we're going to go to heaven. We're in heaven, and then, I'm dying. What am I going to do? Oh no. Where's my Krishna?
Reality sets in.
Yes. Reality sandwiches, right?
Hey, Marc, could you read a few more poems for us?
Okay. Hey, I'll never turn that down. All right, let's see what else we got here. I didn't even pick anything because I thought it'd be more interesting to just oh, geez, I don't even know. This will be interesting. This is called "Where's My Anger Now?" Where's my anger now in the forest shack? I'm tired of it. I nap. I sleep like the dead. Crows tell me to give up anger. Spirits mark territories with strange sticks. I've used anger for my barbed wire thoughts. Leave vengeance to the creature from the Black Lagoon late night cable. Leave it to the mummy shuffling up on a fez hatted traitor. Betrayal baits the wolf man. He gets his claw stuck morning. Comes and it's a naked alcoholic one in the steel jaws with the mournful face of a lost kid, dead. I haven't looked at that for so long. It's like, really? All right, let's see about this one. The clerk is always wrong. 1. In the sublet edge of ghetto gray light through white curtains is a soft drug on my nerves, reading Jim Morrison, tragic rock star bio, escaping work, a memory, and the menopausal supervisor, once a gun-toting leftist, now chief bureaucrat. 2. She was obsessed with the filing boxes under my desks, misaligned cracks in the sidewalk, the supervisor over and over with the boxes, which had some files in them, both mine and my band, The Jobs, or CDs I listened to while mindlessly inputting on the computer, and my wife back from rehab, successful, but we were losing the house, and again, the supervisor with the boxes. She wanted them to go away, her anxious mind inside them. And I said, I work my fucking ass off. I'm so goddamn sick of hearing of those fucking boxes. And a year and a half later, a letter of counsel in my file. She quit. It was worth it. Should I read you another one, or
one more?
Are we done?
Let's do one more.
One more. All right. Let's see what we can pick. Pick something recent. Okay. There's Ginsberg had an interesting thing, which he did as a kind of answer to haiku, which he called the American sentence. And the American sentence is 17 syllables in length per Allen Ginsberg. It's kind of, so these are all American sentences that I wrote. And I'll go through they're very short, so I'll read them all. Unshaven, dirty-haired, tattooed, I was the crazy motherfucker. Full of coffee, they told me, be ready at 8 a.m. Now they aren't here. Oakland afternoon, the angry black high school boys hope for thug life fame. Fun teen billboards suggest everyone has money to buy the latest. LA, a falling palm branch shattered the windshield of my rental car. A clueless jailbait blowjob. Here's R calling from the federal slam. The cat blinks back. It's fantastic. Forget your best poet bullshit prize. And finally, the cruel smirk of a teenage girl turning heads with sudden new glamour.
We really want to thank Marc Olmsted for being our guest, and we recommend you look up his website, marcolmsted.com, to find what he's doing, to read his essays, and to buy his books. Thank you, Marc.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I'm supposed to say goodbye to everyone, right? Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for being here.